Hello and welcome to my weekly book review, and today I want to talk to you about Midas by Tyler Jones, the 18th title in Earthling Publications' Halloween series, but more on the publication details in a little bit. Midas is the first novel I've read by Tyler Jones, and it will not be the last. It is a strong first impression for me. Plus, I have several of his audiobooks now to listen to once I finish my current audiobook. But anyways, Midas is currently only available from Earthling Publications as a limited edition. I imagine it might see a trade edition eventually, maybe in a year and a half. That's about how long it took for Boys in the Valley to get the trade publication. But like I said, I'll talk about those details momentarily. Midas is a story of grief in the Old West. It follows Jeremiah, a former preacher. He was a preacher until he and his family experienced just horrible, horrible tragedy, which has destroyed his faith. It has turned him away from being a preacher and kind of turned him and his wife into sort of outcasts in a way. I mean, they are still very close to their town physically, but they get weird looks from the townsfolk as they pass by. And one day, Jeremiah stumbles upon, on his farm, a rider without a horse. So he goes in search of that rider and finds the corpse of that rider. The rider has with him several gold items that are just too realistic to be believable, other than the fact that he has them in his hand. And the rider also has a map that doesn't seem to make sense. It leads to a location. It's leading to a location that shouldn't exist. And so Jeremiah, his wife, and his brother embark on a journey to find what he believes is going to be the gift of the Midas touch. And that's going to make him cross paths with a cult leader named Solomon and his very, very, very scary cult. So this is, I guess, technically a horror novel, but it doesn't necessarily go for like the gore and shock type of horror. This is more horrific in terms of how it deals with grief, it deals with greed, how it deals with power, and how it deals with just loss in general. It's incredibly well written. Tyler Jones really knocked it out of the park with this one. So, I mean, I don't want to say too much about the novel, but it is divided in two parts. Part one being kind of the adventure that they're going to go on, and part two is definitely more of very strong Gothic horror novel. I don't want to show you the second illustration there because it does contain a spoiler. But yeah, I mean, you get a lot of Gothic undertones throughout the second half of the novel, and it's powerful. It's good stuff. Here, pictured here, Vincent Chong's illustration of Solomon and some of his cult members. And man, what a good read. Seriously, the characters are very strong. They're fleshed out. You feel for them. You feel for Jeremiah. You feel for them, and oh man, it's not fun to experience the type of loss they experience, and it really sets the tone for the entire novel to follow. There is great character development within Jeremiah's arc as he, comes to terms with this loss, comes to terms with his search for this power, for this Midas touch. Emma, his wife, has just the most tragic. I mean, she's experiencing the same loss that Jeremiah does, but it's hard for a mother to experience that kind of loss. It's the loss of a kid if you couldn't put it together. That's not really a spoiler. Like I said, the novel very much makes that apparent within the opening chapters. After the prologue introduces you to Solomon and his cult. There isn't much characterization for Solomon and his cult other than they are cultists who want this power for themselves, this Midas touch for themselves. We are kind of introduced to his cult mostly in the second half of the novel. And there's some pretty mean dudes with some pretty mean objectives. And man, like this is probably one of my favorite reads of the year, which actually brings me to the production details of it. As I mentioned, this was published by Earthling Publications as part of their Halloween series, Paul Miller's Halloween series. It has nice orange end papers to kind of go along with that. So the novel itself does not actually deal with Halloween. It just happens to be a series that Paul Miller produces every year in time for Halloween. And the last few years, Paul Miller has really knocked it out of the park. So Midas here by Tyler Jones, one of my favorite novels of this year. Last year was Marla by Jonathan Janz, one of my favorite novels from last year. The prior year was Boys in the Valley, which is one of my favorite novels in the last several years, last several decades. It is just, he's knocking it out of the park, and Paul Miller is really kind of up in the ante to try to keep beating that or keep reaching that level of quality within the storytelling. I mean, the quality within the production is always going to be there with an Earthling title. You have beautiful cloth boards, sewn bindings. Like I said, very nice paper quality, plus the signatures itself. It has interior artwork, as I was showing you, by Vincent Chong. There are 3 pieces of interior artwork. Don't look ahead at the second one, because that will reveal a spoiler. Speaking of spoilers, this is signed by Tyler Jones and Josh Malerman. Malerman did the introduction, and I feel like the introduction should have been an afterword. There is one sentence here that, I mean, it's a solid introduction. I mean, he says right here, this book fucking rules, and he is absolutely right on that. That being said, there is a statement he makes later in the introduction where he talks about how the novel is a little less King Midas and a little more of a short story. And I'm not going to say what that short story is, because it sort of spoils a very major event in the second half of the novel. And I gotta say, what you're kind of a jerk there, Josh Malerman. What the hell? Otherwise, very great introduction. But you know, if you do read that and you are familiar with the other short story that he mentions, there's probably gonna be an event, a very major event that you'll probably see coming. So I would almost recommend not reading the introduction until afterwards. Read it more as an afterword than an introduction. But seriously, it is like he was. Oh my God, I can't speak English anymore. Tyler Jones was actually just on a podcast called Paper Cuts, where he was talking with the hosts as well as Ross Jeffrey, another horror author, about this sort of subgenre of horror called grief horror, which he wasn't very familiar with at the time, but they kind of talked about how, you know, these characters are driven by their grief, and it's very, very powerful but very dark writing styles or dark subject matter. And I gotta say, I mean, think like Pet Sematary is grief horror. That short story that Josh Malerman mentions that it has almost a spoiler for this is grief horror. But Midas is certainly up there with grief horror. It was actually a really solid interview. Some very, very great words from Tyler Jones within that podcast, which I'll put a link to the description below to that podcast if you want to check it out. But believe it or not, Midas is still available. Oh, he also talked about how he didn't want to use the title Midas because he didn't want it to be kind of subjected to that King Midas treatment. I mean, definitely kind of has connections to King Midas, but I would agree that it's not necessarily just a retelling of the King Midas story. It goes its own way. But anyways, I am still amazed this is still available through Earthling Publications, because a lot of Earthlings titles do sell out, so you should definitely pick up a copy before it sells out. That way you don't have to wait several years before you can get a trade edition. Seriously, Tyler Jones has written an incredible novel here with Midas. Paul Miller has knocked it completely out of the park once again with his Halloween series, and it's something that you should read. Do it for Flea on the cover here. Flea's not having a good time, but you can have a good time by checking out Midas. I got at least one book review a week, but plenty of unboxing videos in between those book reviews, so please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Paul Miller, for an incredible publication, Tyler Jones for a haunting tale, and thank you guys for watching. We'll see you around next time.